Hello my friends, it's Kayla. Today I'm telling you all about the books that I read in October. Here are my stats for the month. Everything is here. If you care to look at any and now it's gone. And now we're gonna run through everything. So I don't know how many books there are, but I just had it up on the screen that I haven't made yet. I think it's 17. Correct. And I organized it today by like most realistic to least realistic. We're going to start with the 4 nonfiction books that I read this month. First up, we have Freedom is a Constant Struggle by Angela Y. Davis, Ferguson, Palestine, and the Foundations of a Movement. This is a collection of interviews and speeches that Angela Davis, who's a well-known public figure, has given. Something that didn't work in this for me was just the repetition of things, because it's a collection of interviews and not like a super curated collection, not written as it was intended to be one piece. There is a good amount of repetition. So she talks about her history of being on the FBI's most wanted list and certain things she's experienced in life, and those come up a couple times because naturally when she's giving different speeches and interviews, she's going to cover her past and her history and give us insight. But what I think it does best and why I would recommend it to a lot of people is if you're already familiar with a lot of the ideas presented in here, especially as far as racial injustice, especially in the United States, prison reform, abolishing the police, conversations surrounding that, this gives her perspective on things. She's obviously an incredibly intelligent woman, and because this is so conversational, you feel very let into everything, and she just gives you more vocabulary for these conversations and why certain things are so important. It very much talks about the collective we and global solidarity with all of the humanitarian issues going on around the globe and have been for decades. Obviously it touches on Palestine, which is a reason that I picked it up this month. I wouldn't say that this is the book that you should pick up for like a history, like a starting point of Palestine. There are so many nonfiction books about history itself. This is not an entry point for that, but because she so easily weaves that into so many of these other conversations, that if you don't know a lot about Palestine and the genocide that's currently happening, I think the way that it's integrated into here would help you make a lot of connections if you're already familiar with the conversations around what's happening in the United States, especially, or historically when we're talking about colonization and enslavement and the way that all of these systems of oppression were set up and how they still exist from the very beginning, and her covering politics and the US's relationship with the Middle East and how, you know, Barack Obama becoming president. Let me just read her own words. Many of the assumptions regarding the significance of Obama's election are entirely wrong, especially those that depict a black man in the US presidency as symbolizing the fall of the last barrier of racism. And then it goes on to say, the problem was that people who associated themselves with that movement did not continue to wield that collective power as pressure that might have compelled Obama to move in more progressive directions. For example, against a military surge in Afghanistan, towards a swift dismantling of the detainment camp at Guantanamo, toward a stronger healthcare plan, etc. So it's talking about like people's relationship with politics and how you may think that something has been accomplished when you have this certain goal, but then when that goal happens, people feel like they can't be critical of, you know, the person that they have now helped place in power, when that's not how political relationships should work. As I'm not American, some of these things didn't apply to me, but they were obviously very good for me to read, and I highly recommend that one. So then I felt it important for me to read something specifically Canadian. This is called Advocating for Palestine in Canada, History's Movements Action. It was edited by a whole bunch of people, and there are so many essays and statistic gathering that has happened in here that every section of maybe like 15 has an entire index and appendix of where the information came from and who contributed to that section. This isn't exactly what I expected it to be. I thought it would be kind of like whatever this one's called that I read a couple years ago, 21 Things You May Not Know About the Indian Act. I thought it would be a lot of calls to action, and that's not what this was. But it was super valuable because it gave a history of how Canada has advocated for Palestine. And, you know, as somebody who's only been aware of the politics in my country and been able to like legally vote for 15 years, I was just not aware of so many different organizations that came before that time. So it kicked off with teaching me about the movement for Palestinian human rights and self-determination in Canada. We read this foreword by Libby Davies, who was a member of parliament in 1997, who was involved in working for Palestinian recognition and rights, and just how this movement has changed over the years and how different people in power, and again, just like this one critiques the political figureheads, this one does as well. And even if you voted somebody in at some certain point in your life doesn't mean that those people are without critique. There's just so many issues with the entire political system. I mean, in most places. But just talked about how things happened when Stephen Harper became prime minister, when Justin Trudeau became prime minister, what happened when the World Trade Center was attacked, and how everything impacts relationships everywhere. Again, this one is not so much a history of Palestine. This is not what I would recommend for people wanting to learn about Palestine, but if you are Canadian or you're interested in Canadian politics and the relationship with Palestine, this was fantastic. And then at the end, it did start to talk more about like the current issues and weaknesses with the Palestine solidarity movement, the threats to the solidarity movement, the opportunities for the movement, and just gives you a really good idea of what you can do and how you can help. So this ended up being a really good combination of things for me to read this month. Then my next two nonfiction books that I read are things that I read about media and our relationship with it. And these will be featured in an upcoming video, so pretend I didn't already talk about them. Unlikable Female Characters, The Women Pop Culture Wants You to Hate by Anna Bogost-Takaya. And this is a list of exactly that. The women pop culture wants you to hate. It's organized into sections. We've got just the intro, how not to be a girl, how society sees women, and how they get put into different boxes in TV and movies, especially. Like they're the mean girl, or they're the fuck up, the train wreck, the weirdo, whatever archetype they've been placed in, and they have to behave a certain way. They're used as like a morality lesson. No woman can just be like sexually free. She has to be deemed the slut in the movie, and she has to be there to exist to teach us something. I really liked the idea of it. I ended up giving it a 3. I think it would be a good entry point for a lot of people. I think it should have been maybe remarketed. Actually, let me grab a book that I think it should have been made into. More of like a coffee table book, and more targeted at teens. So because a lot of the ideas and conversations were a little bit basic, I wasn't impressed by the writing in any specific way. I just think it could have benefited from being more like fun to look at, engaging in this way, especially because in this day and age, all of those archetypes exist in teen TV shows, and it would be good if this could be in the hands of teens. Or maybe at the beginning of your journey of feminism and understanding how media portrays people and how our views of things get manipulated by the people creating the shows. Now, the next one I also think should have been a coffee table book, but I did give it 5 stars. And that's The Black Guy Dies First, Black Horror Cinema from Fodder to Oscar. This is by Robin R. Means Coleman, PhD, and Mark H. Harris. And it does look fun and engaging, but when you just pick it up, it feels like it's gonna be a novel, and it's not. I also don't think this should have been turned into an audiobook. I listened to it. It is not good as an audiobook, not because of the narrator, but because of just the way that things are constantly listed. Again, this is full of archetypes. We have different racist stereotypes and tropes and archetypes that people have been placed into, especially in horror. This does go beyond the genre. It's talking about like action and thriller films as well, but it all makes sense together. And there's things listed like the voice of reason. The person has to be placed into the role of the sidekick. And then it also just lists a bunch of movies that fit into that, and it's not fun to listen to. It's something that you would not want to read front to back in a short period of time. It's something kind of like I can't think of a better example, but like Guinness Book of World Records, that you're not reading front to back in one sitting, but you're glancing through, and then you'll go in and you'll read the sections that you're most interested in. That's how I'd recommend reading this, because it also does get repetitive, because there are obviously, especially lately, certain horror films by Black directors and starring Black actors that are incredible. And they obviously wanted to highlight those, but then there's not a lot of other comparison. So those same ones, like Jordan Peele and his films, and the synopsis of those films and the impact of those films kind of happened multiple times and were mentioned multiple times. But it was an incredibly well done like collection of thoughts, and the history of Black individuals in cinema, the impact, the just cultural journey that has happened. It spoils a lot of horror movies, but not in a way that I feel like, I don't want to say it like completely objectively, but in my opinion, if you haven't watched a lot of these, since there are so many mentioned, it would probably be easy to like forget which ones and how they were spoiled for when you actually watch the movie like months or years from now. You probably won't remember exactly the spoilers for the one that you want to see. And then it's also easy because like the titles are pretty bold and large, easy for you to skip over ones that you really don't want to hear about until you've seen. But if you are super familiar with horror movies, I think that this is something that I would recommend highly, just because it's something that I think is so fascinating. Next, we've just got some realistic fiction. I don't want to rate this. This happened to me last month as well. However, it is the book that I picked out of my members TBR jar for the month. And so I have to give it a rating in order for it to fit into the thing that we're doing here with the members TBR jar, which is I pull one every month. And if I like half of them by the end of the year, I will continue picking one a month next year. So this doesn't make me super comfortable to rate, just like last month the Deloriad didn't, but much like the Deloriad, I have to give it a 3. And I feel bad about it. I feel weird about it. It's called How to Become a Planet by Nicole Melleby. And I am lately trying to separate my emotions from my review of a book, because just because something has an emotional impact, makes me cry, doesn't necessarily mean it was a great book. But I associate those two things with each other because I think it's hard to make me emotionally impacted sometimes by fiction. And this one is about a young girl who's the exact same age as my son, who is dealing with depression. And it is a really rough read. I feel like I've read a lot of books on this topic and they typically end up being YA. So I appreciate the fact that this is more middle grade appropriate. And because I'm not 12 or 13 or know any 12 or 13-year-olds who have read this, I can't say anything about this except my personal thoughts on it. But when I think of this, I don't know that I would recommend it to, I don't know who I would recommend it to, because if you are that age and you are going through depression, I don't think that this would make you see anything differently or feel anything beyond just being able to relate, I suppose. But I don't know if that's enough to read so much sadness for so long. Plot is just this girl, Pluto, and we're spending the summer with her, and she's depressed. She's really depressed, and every scene is about that and her visiting therapist and her trying to talk to her family. And her family and her friends become more open throughout the book, and she you know, there's no bad messaging in here. She doesn't become instantly magically fixed by anything. It's hope-filled, but not like in a cheesy way. But because you're just in her head for hundreds of pages and she doesn't know why she's sad, she doesn't know how to explain what's wrong with her. She's having a really hard time. She's just having a really hard time for hundreds of pages. And it's just such a tough read. And then if I would recommend it to Liam, who doesn't relate to this, I don't know that it's written in a way that would, not that it would not give you empathy for people in real life who you might encounter who are dealing with something similar, but I don't know that going through this again and reading this sadness for hundreds and hundreds of pages would be the #1 way I would recommend that somebody wanting to understand depression and gaining empathy, I don't know if this would be the #1 avenue that I would suggest. I don't know. It wasn't a fun read, obviously, but it wasn't supposed to be. I don't think I take issue with anything in here. I just don't know that I would call this a great book. But it has a high average rating, and I know a lot of people, I've seen like a lot of adults rate it highly and say that it's great for them. So I'm just gonna move on to 0 Days by Ruth Ware. This one was a 2 point something, I can't remember, for me. It was a really exhausting thriller. I read a lot of really exhausting books this month, books that felt claustrophobic, that I was stuck in, that I was suffocating through the reading of. And this is another one that I just felt exhausted reading about this woman. And I feel bad about it because I want to like Ruth Ware. I have liked Ruth Ware and I wanted this to be such a win, but we're following this woman and her husband just died, and they worked together hacking into security systems. That was their job. They tested security systems for businesses to see if they could access certain parts of buildings and certain paperwork information, computer systems and all of that. And one day after a job, she goes home and her husband has been killed. And she is clearly about to be accused of that. And so she decides to go on the run and find out what actually happened to him so she could bring that information to the police and get the culprit taken care of. What it turns out to be, though, is just like her in various spaces, not really doing a lot, hiding out, trying to figure out who she can trust, trusting the wrong people, taking the little information that she has and making giant leaps of logic, and her constantly like feeling pain and injured and not being able to eat and just struggling her way through this book. And I feel like I like survival stories, so I should have liked this, but it just ended up being a far more basic thriller than what I would expect from an author this deep into her career. Next up, I've got two short story collections. I didn't know where to put these in the realistic to unrealistic range, but this one was a 3 and this one was a 4. So I Hold a Wolf by the Ears by Laura Vandenberg is a collection of really realistic, mostly stories that just feel like there's something going on in the background, like they feel a little bit ominous, but they're not fantastical or horror, which is kind of what I was expecting. I would say most of the stories revolve around death. So genuinely, I don't remember a single one from here vividly. I remember some of them take place in like this motel where a bunch of people live. Some of them have to do with like encountering old friends, and they all have, I wouldn't even say grief, just death at the center. Someone has died or they're about to die. It's about grappling with that, and they're just slice of life kind of stories. On the back it says they're sideways ghost stories that linger in the mouth and the mind, both timeless and urgent. They confront misogyny, violence, and the impossible economics of America. Nothing was memorable in here, but I gave every story a 3, I think, except for maybe 1 or 2 that I gave a little higher and a little lower. Sorry for my lack of review for that one. It has been a while. This one, though, had more of an impact. My favorite ones were from the authors that I've already read from before, which was great. It's called Never Whistle at Night. It's edited by Shane Hawk and Theodore C. Van Alst Jr., and it's Indigenous dark fiction. So again, I went into this one expecting it to be more horror. It wasn't. There are horrifying things that happen in here. It's confronting a lot of things like violence and abuse and colonization, displacement, death, family trauma. So it's not so much horrifying creatures, or it's not scary for the reader, but it is obviously horrible circumstances these people are in. My absolute favorite in here was Scariest Story Ever by Richard Van Camp, which just talked about like storytelling and the importance of stories and respect and your elders. I also love the one by Darcy Littlebadger called The Scientist's Horror Story. I guess I just like the ones that are about storytelling. And then my other favorite was the one in the back called Limbs by Wabgisha Grice, who wrote one of my favorite horror books ever, Moon of the Crusted Snow. And this actually had really similar themes about like communities and infiltration. And then the one that I love from an author that I haven't read from before is Carson Faust, who I guess has a horror novel upcoming next year. It was called Eulogy for a Brother Resurrected, which definitely centered grief and I enjoyed. So it's not that these ones, because they dealt with death and kind of grief, that I didn't like them. I can't explain this one, but let's move on to some horror. We've got horror, but more fever dream elements with Rouge by Mona Awad. This was sent to me by the publisher, but Mona Awad's one of my favorites, so I was going to read it regardless. I ended up giving it a 3. I, again, have no real issues with this, and I would recommend it for sure, especially if you loved her last novel as well. It's really similar themes. But for me, it was just too long. When I'm in this fever dream kind of situation, I want to be in and out of it. I just want some weirdness and then it's over. I don't, again, like I felt suffocated by this. I don't want to be in this claustrophobic mind for 400 pages. It's about this woman named Belle, and her mother recently died and she is going to attend her funeral, and there's this woman there who says something weird, and she ends up staying in the town for a little bit, talking to different people who knew her mother. They're all saying weird stuff to her. She eventually gets convinced to go to this spa where her mother also went, and it's taken in by them in a cult-ish kind of way. And it's about her and her obsession with skincare and beauty and her confusion with her mother being so obsessed with her looks, but always telling Belle she was so beautiful, while they look so different, and her mother, you know, constantly wanting to change her own appearance and look a certain way, and having such a standard of beauty that didn't match her daughter, that made her daughter end up feeling so insecure. So she just becomes obsessed with this idea of beauty and how to obtain it. The book itself felt as long and descriptive as Belle's like 30-step skincare routine was. It's fairy tale inspired, but didn't read like a fairy tale. It's so low plot that it didn't feel like you were in this whimsical situation. You were just in her mind, where she's just confused about what's going on around her. It's another book about grief, obviously, but I think the most impactful parts about grief were kind of the implications about grieving your past self, grieving your past innocence, grieving your past naivete before, you know, somebody died, or your life path altered, or you gave into society's expectations, and thinking back on the more peaceful version of yourself that existed. I like how weird it was, but I really need her to start writing novellas. Speaking of novellas, we've got The Ballad of Black Tom by Victor LaValle. This is a response, a retelling of an H.P. Lovecraft book that I also read, that I don't have here because it was just a short story, in a collection of short stories called The Murder at Red Hook, I think? The Horror at Red Hook, which is about a detective trying to look into this occult underground dark magic. And in this one, we're still following that detective, but we're also following these characters that get introduced in here. Black Tom and his father, who get the type of agency that they wouldn't have in the Lovecraft story, where they are dealing with oppression and hate. And they're obviously struggling, but they have more decisions that they get to make. They have more choices. Black Tom is dealing and trading like occult items, and he gets involved in this the dark society that the detective is looking into, and yeah, they just come into contact with each other and figure everything out. I can't spoil anything else because it was a novella. I gave it a 4. I really liked it. The atmosphere, incredible, and I want to read more from him for sure, just for the descriptions, the historical New York setting. Moving on to the next one, which I called in my vlog, and I stand by, romance by way of horror. This is Vampires of El Norte by Isabel Cañas, and it's about these two characters. Highly recommend the audiobook. It was fantastic. Their names are Nena and Nestor, and the book opens up with them in their kind of adolescent childhood, and their friendship is so strong, but their families don't necessarily want them to be spending this much time together. And the chapter ends with something horrific happening with a vampire-like entity, and then they are separated for many years, and we return 9 years later, and they're coming back into contact with each other when they might not have even known the other has been around or alive. And so they're reconnecting and trying to figure out what their relationship is now. They're immediately pulled back into each other's orbit, but they still have the pressures of their families and the expectations on them. And then they go on this an adventure kind of together. He is a part of the auxiliary cavalry, as it's 1846 in Mexico. And while they're dealing with war, and while they're dealing with the idea of these vampire creatures, they're also falling in love. And there's so much feeling in the writing. And I just feel like Isabel Cañas could be a favorite author of mine in the future. I have no doubt she will get a 5-star. I love her writing. I love the epicness that this relationship felt. But there's still something keeping me from a 5-star, and I don't totally know what that is, but I would definitely recommend this for fans of historical, gothic, light supernatural stuff. Like, it's so good. Next up, we've got another horror from multiple POVs. It's called The Reformatory by Tanana Reeve-Dew. This one I did give a 5-star. We have siblings, Robbie and Gloria, and the setting is 1950 in Florida, and we're following Black characters, and Robbie as a young boy being taken to a reformatory as a form of punishment. And when he gets there, he realizes he can connect with the ghosts and figures out what is actually happening at this reformatory. It's based on the real Dozier School for Boys, and the acknowledgements talks all about Tanana Reeve-Dew's like own family history and this school and how things were inspired by it, and some things completely aren't, and like why she decided to put it all together. But while Robbie's supposed to be there for 6 months, his sister doesn't believe that he's going to survive that time in there, and she's doing everything on her end that she can to get him out. And while that's happening, she gets involved in all of these things outside of that, things that are really harmful to her, things that benefit her, and it's just this journey of using your resources while experiencing oppression to survive and get back with your family. It's haunted for sure, but that's not the horror of it. The horror of it is what is happening at this school. The horrific and vile people who are there and what they are doing to these children. It's definitely one that you would want to take your time reading because it's a tough read. It is bleak, necessarily bleak. Moving on to a sci-fi mystery, The Death I Gave Him by MX Liu. This really confirmed my opinion that I don't like my sci-fi mixed with other genres very often, because this just did not do it for me. I gave it a 2.5. Even though it was so set up for me to like, I just don't think that it worked. So in it we have this man named Hayden, and his father dies in the opening of the book and accuses somebody of murdering him as he's dying. And so Hayden spends the book now locked into this laboratory where him and his father and various other people were working on a way to create immortality. But now that he has died, obviously the person who did it is in this laboratory. So it's a locked room mystery where it's not so much about finding out who did it, which I feel like would have been more enjoyable because you know who did it, but it's about Hayden proving who did it and then wanting to get his revenge, because again, that's what his father wants. He's basically like, this person killed me, avenge me. It was another one of the books this month that I just felt so exhausted by. The descriptions of the science stuff was fine, but then the descriptions, the aggressive amount of descriptions of everybody's like facial expressions and hand movements and thought processes was so exhausting for no reason. And I know that other people are really liking this, and I wish that I was a part of it, because I love Shakespeare-inspired stories. It's inspired by Hamlet. I love the cover. It's a debut author. Like, I just wanted to love it so much. I saw a lot of people and see a lot of people tagging this as queer on Goodreads, and I just don't know that I can say that when one of the individuals in the party is non-human. What it has going for it, it was absolutely unique. It had an interesting premise. The communication style and things going on in people's minds, it was interesting. It just didn't hold my attention and did not entertain. Then we've got The Adventures of Amina al-Sirafi by Shannon Chakraborty, and this I gave a 4, and I'm excited to continue in the series. I thought, like, when I read this, I decided in my head that this was a 5-book series because she gets given, she's a midlife? What's that called? She is a middle-aged woman who has had many relationships and a child, and she used to be a pirate, and she was very intimidating and everyone was scared of her, and she accomplished all of these things, and now she is more or less retired, living a very peaceful life with her daughter. And at the beginning of the book, she gets brought back into the pirate scheme of it all and gets given a task that we learn is like one of 5 tasks that she has to do. So I imagined it as a 5-book series, but then it says it's a trilogy. So I actually think that that would probably do well, because then we can have multiple tasks in the other books, because this one you also needed a lot of setup and a lot of information. There was so much learning about the magic that existed in here, things that Amina knew and things that Amina didn't. And so you're learning along with her. And basically her task is just to rescue this person who's been kidnapped. And along the way, she has to build this crew. She has to encounter all of these creatures. And it was just really fun and interesting and funny. I haven't laughed out loud at a book in quite a while. I think there was like 3 different occasions where I was chuckling, and it was so fun. There's this storytelling quality where you can tell, and the reason it feels kind of low stakes is it's told as like a history. It's like, this is the story I want to tell. This is everything that happened. And she has somebody, a scribe, essentially telling the story with her. And it's just really fun to read that back and forth and the building of the story. It's right up my alley. I know that I felt confident about my 4 in the video, so I might have to go back and realize the things that I didn't like about it that didn't give the 5 energy, but I am very excited to continue in the series, and maybe if once I do that I come back to this one, it could have a higher rating. Next up, we've got The Witch's Heart by Genevieve Gornichek. This is the story of Angrboda and her witchy powers and her being hated by Odin, and she ends up fleeing, surviving in the forest, and then she meets this guy named Loki, and they're all gods. I still don't know anything about mythology. And they have children, and their children are like half or part creature, and I guess the mythology is that these children grow up, and she's known as like the mother of monsters, and the way that they impact the world of the gods is the inspiration for Genevieve Granichek's story. And in here, it's like the first half is very slice of life and just her having these children, which was not in the original mythology, and her like not knowing if she can trust Loki, if he's a good partner for her. He's off having children with other people and perhaps committing terrible acts, and everyone kind of hates him, but she sees like the good in him. And the story gets much more action heavy as it goes on, as she decides how she's going to use her powers and if she's going to shake up the world. But it's also the story of survival and her wanting to protect these children and herself. And I really liked it. I gave it 4 stars. Somebody blurbed it and said it was at once mythic and intimate, and that's exactly what I think about it. It's obviously at this point not the most memorable, but it's more memorable than the next one, because this one, in the video that I read it and spoke about it, I said I will never think about these characters again, and I still have not at this point. In fact, I've forgotten like the entire plot of this. So it's called The Foxglove King by Hannah Witten, and I remember it was about like drugs, and it was about magic, and there's this necromancy, so people can like bring people back from the dead, but it's also kind of an illegal magic. And we have one character who is being brought into this kingdom because she can do this, and she has to spy on one of the people in the kingdom for someone else in the kingdom to have power, I guess. And she like falls in love with him and then also her guard, and so there's this love triangle, and all the while she is trying to be a spy and find out things about these different people, and if the person that she's spying on is a good person or not, because the rumors are that he's using this necromancy power for bad. That's all I remember about it. I gave it a 2.5. Did I give it a 2.5? That feels a little high now. I think my main critique, I remember saying that I don't think we earned the romance. I don't think the romance made a lot of sense. It was just like, because everyone was there and because it's traditional to like fall in love with 2 people who don't like each other, that creates this tension. And that's just what the book wanted to be, even though I didn't feel like it made sense or worked. That's that on that. And finally, we're ending with a 5-star, Mammoths at the Gates by Nevo. This is this really fun series where we're following a cleric who is going to different areas and meeting different people, and all of these storytellings are happening. And in this one, we're going back to Chi, the cleric's kind of home, and they had this mentor who's recently died, and that's an impact in the story. But also the story that we're learning within the story is about these mammoths and war and a flooding of this town, and there are bones under the water, and now that they're draining the city, the bones have the ability to tell their own story. There was a lot of really good takeaways in here. This is my 3rd favorite of the series. My favorite will always be the first one, The Empress of Salt and Fortune, and then it's the tiger one, then it's this one, then it's the one with like the warthog on the cover. Obviously it's short, so I don't want to tell you too much, but if you are reading the series, I'm sure you are continuing to like it just like me. And I know that you can probably read them out of order, but I don't see why, because they're such short novellas that I would never recommend reading that before anything else. So pick up the series. It's very good. That's everything that I read in October that you get to know about. There are a couple secret things going on as usual, but those will come to be seen in the coming months. So thank you so much for tuning in, and let me know what you thought of any of these books if you read them yourself, and I'll see you later. Bye.